Hello and welcome to another Bible study video of First Presbyterian Church of Bartlesville, Oklahoma. We're looking at lectionary passages again this week, follow-up of last week. We're focusing on the passages identified for August 30th, 2020. Last week we opened with the beginning of Exodus chapter 1 and the story of the Pharaoh or the new king that knew not Joseph and all of what that meant. This week we pick up a couple of chapters later in Exodus 3 and it's the story of Moses and what he's doing after he has fled Egypt and his encounter with God. And then also the Matthew passage in chapter 16 that follows the passage from last week about Caesarea Philippi and Jesus asking the disciples, "Who do you say that I am?" So reading from Exodus chapter 3, beginning at verse 7. Then the Lord said, "I have observed the misery of my people who are in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Indeed, I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them from the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the country of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. The cry of the Israelites has now come to me. I have also seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." But Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" He said, "I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that it is I who sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain." But Moses said to God, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." He said further, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my title for all generations." So Moses, of course, has fled Egypt due to his murdering of an Egyptian. Essentially, I think he's unable to handle this deep division of his identity as a man born Hebrew but raised Egyptian and all of what that means. And he's fled to a place where he doesn't have to face this and he can hide. And the setting of our passage is Mount Horeb, the mountain of God, or Mount Sinai. And we're told that when Moses frees the Hebrews from the Egyptian oppression, a sign that God is with them is that they will come and worship God on this very same mountain. Present are Moses and the burning bush, a theophany or appearance of God. And Moses is told immediately preceding this passage to remove his sandals. The ground upon which he stands is holy. The Hebrew word is Hokadesh. And it isn't simply this place is holy in and of itself, but it was what was taking place that was sacred. So what is taking place in this moment? Well, Moses is told by God what God is aware of and how it influences and affects God. God tells Moses that he has observed the misery of my people in Egypt. God has heard their cry on account of their taskmasters. Now that's very specific, what God is hearing and what is causing God to respond. God knows their sufferings. This means that God more than noticed what was going on or even acknowledged and observed or realized. This means that there was passion on the part of God. Now this is, of course, the Greek word passion, and it means something very emotive, very powerful. And of course, we think about the gospel story of Jesus when he was arrested and tried and tortured and then crucified as Jesus' passion. And this is the same sense of what is going on here, that God feels with the Hebrews and personally experiences their suffering. So the cries of the Hebrews rise up to God. Now, pay attention to the direction that is mentioned in this passage. The cries rise up to God, and then Moses is told that God's response is to come down and deliver them from their oppressors in order to bring them up to a land of prosperity and fullness. The cries rise up, God comes down, God lifts God's people up. And then, still standing on this holy, sacred ground, God calls Moses to participate in this deliverance of God's people. Now, this is a phenomenally critical moment since Moses has fled Egypt. We are told that he did so because he was wanted for murder. But at the root of all this is his struggle over his identity. Am I Hebrew or am I Egyptian? This struggle is so great that he flees, he runs away, he tries to hide from his identity struggle and settles into an alternative identity, a sort of in-between identity as a sheep herder for someone else. He chooses a life essentially that doesn't require him to face his own internal turmoil to deal with his own crisis. Think about times in your own life or anyone's life when we want to just run away. We want to get out of our own skin, to escape it. We want to vacate it and live some alternative identity. Midlife crisis, perhaps, breakdown in a marriage or whatever. There are all sorts of times when we have these identity crises. Until, of course, Moses stands on this holy ground and sees this bush that is burning but isn't consumed. Now, this is the sort of thing that lets one know that hiding isn't an option. Consequently, we see that God tells Moses that he is to participate in God's work of liberation. So Moses, of course, hesitates and resists in two ways. First, he asks God, "Who am I to do this?" And of course, he reinforces that with his lack of skills. God answers and says, "I will be with you." It's an interesting way to answer that question. Not explaining to him, the skills that he has and why God, but God's answer to, "Who am I to do this for you?" God says, "I will be with you," which actually is a hint at the answer God provides in response to Moses' second question he uses to challenge this frightening prospect of returning to Egypt. In other words, God nullifies Moses' first objection with his answer that anticipates Moses' second query that is intended to, of course, deflate God's call of Moses. So after saying, "Who am I to do this?" Moses' second question after God answers is, "Who are you to do this?" Which is to say, okay, let's imagine I get over there to Egypt and I make this demand for you. Just who are you that others are going to listen and not string me up? And the interesting thing about this is the question is directed at, who am I to tell the Israelites sent me? Who am I to tell the Israelites sent me? Not who am I to tell the Pharaoh sent me, but the Israelites. How will I convince your people, especially as one who was born as a Hebrew but was raised as an Egyptian and has fled? Why would they trust me? In other words, what credentials do you have that will protect me when I stick my neck out for you? And he asks this by asking for God's name, which was the basis, of course, of knowing another's authority. It's like name recognition today. A child tells a sibling to leave her stuff alone, and the response is, "Oh yeah, who says? You're not the boss of me." And the answer is daddy or mommy or whoever has authority over the other child as well. So Moses can't imagine that this deity that he's having this conversation with has any authority back in Egypt with the Egyptians who will acknowledge this authority, and even the Israelites. And while God accepts this question as valid, God isn't going to fit into a box. God isn't going to be limited in the way that names can limit, isn't going to be burdened with the baggage of an identity that limits God. Now, this is a really critical moment because up to this point, the word the Hebrews had used for God were words that had been borrowed from other belief systems and other religions. And so at this moment, God is identifying God's self for the people in a very unique and powerful way that differentiates God, Yahweh, from all the other deities and gods that are worshipped. In fact, the name is so powerful and sacred and holy, they're not to take God's name in vain. To simply utter it was sacrilegious, was profane. So they came up with a nickname and didn't use vowels at all. And that's where we get the word Yahweh. And that word is always translated in the Old Testament as Lord, and it's always capitalized. So God offers God's name as I am who I am, or I will be whoever I will be, built on the Hebrew verb to be. And it can imply even, I will do what I will do. I'll bring this about. This is who I am. You will know me in my actions. This is both very specific in that God is saying, I am without limits and there is none other like me, as well as very broad in that God is saying, I am without limits and I am beyond language or comprehension to even define. So Moses' authority resides in God's authority as author of everything. I am. And then God offers a peek at who I am is in the reminder, of course, of the past promise and heritage. I'm the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. Now let's shift to the gospel lesson because the themes present in the Exodus passage continue in Matthew chapter 16, verses 21 through 28. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord. This must never happen to you. But Jesus turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are a stumbling block to me, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and then he will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. So, the very first words of this passage are significant, and they follow, of course, Jesus' explanation of who he is after he asks the disciples, Who do you say that I am? And Peter confesses, You are the Son of God. And Jesus says, Blessed are you that you recognize this because God has revealed this to you. And our passage today then follows immediately after that and says, From this time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders, chief priests, and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. So what is this moment that is so defining. Matthew divides his telling of Jesus' life between what happened before this and what happened after this by saying, from that time on. And the division was the fine point Jesus put on explaining what he must endure as the Son of God, the promised one, the Messiah. But for Peter, it just doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. It's contrary to his gut instinct and his mental construct of how God's story plays out in the world and for God's people. So he quickly steps up to defend Jesus. Now, I don't know if he was feeling proud or obligated because of what Jesus said to him, that he would be the foundation upon which he would build his church. But whatever he felt, he understood his role and his identity as one who will lead the fight to protect Jesus from this preposterous attack that Jesus has said would happen. How could I let this happen to you? Not on my watch, Jesus. Just stay behind me and I'll go down defending you. But Peter doesn't understand. And who can blame him? This death and defeat of leadership has been the end of all the movements to liberate the Hebrews. It's the way of losers. It's counterintuitive after all. Victory is about defeating one's opponent, not being defeated by them. Victory comes through heroic conquering, of being the last one standing after one's opponent has fallen on the battlefield. Victory is about power and strength and might and conquering and standing tall on the heap of all the vanquished foes. Victory is not surrender and suffering and defeat. But Jesus quickly puts this idea where it belongs when he says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." And just like the Exodus passage, we see here that love hears the cries and suffers on behalf of those who are loved in order to deliver them from the bondage that keeps them slaves. This is the burning bush that is not consumed. It never runs out of fuel. It never turns to ash. It never stops burning. It is God's on-fire love for God's people, and it burns as it suffers with and for them, and it will never be exhausted. It burns eternally and feels the destruction of oppression and gives off the heat of holy love. Does it make sense to us who are limited, those of us who are tired and overwhelmed by challenges, those of us who flee suffering, those of us who desire to burn down our enemies and leave them in the gray ash of defeat? No. This is the mystery of God's unfathomable love. And this act of God on behalf of those who suffer the oppression of our own self-divinity slavery calls us to follow in this path of suffering as we are instruments and demonstration of God's love in a world that will not understand, even as God's love will not stop burning. The divided identity of Moses provides for us an illustration of the transition we experience as people who are living on our own means and become people living by the grace of God. To experience salvation is a wonderful, liberating moment of joy, but the challenges of how this identity manifests itself in our daily living is full of mistakes, missteps, and confusion about how we are to be faithful. Some of us are fine with just tending the sheep of another, spending time watching over these lambs while avoiding the challenge of exposing ourselves to the hard work of relating to others genuinely, authentically, and honestly, and compassionately, while also not compromising who we are as God's people. While others of us are more like Peter, and we're ready to fight to the death, to jump into the ring and defend Jesus from whoever doesn't respect him as the Son of God, pointing the finger of judgment, determining who is in the faith club and who is not? Well, neither extreme, neither of these responses, though they are incredibly common expressions of Christianity throughout history, and most certainly today, fits what our scripture passages describe as faithfulness. Instead, the act of sacrifice, as demonstrated by God in Jesus Christ, is the way of faithfulness. Hearing the cries of those who suffer and entering that suffering sacrificially, loving enough to suffer on behalf of those who suffer. That's taking up the cross and following Jesus. Amen. And God bless you.